This session will be on the biblical book of Judges. What are the themes of the book of Judges? There are several. The first we get in the first couple of chapters, and that is that Israel was unfaithful in taking the land, and they went through a cycle of sin, crying out, and deliverance by God with the use of a judge or charismatic war hero. We'll take that up again after a while. The Lord, secondly, had promised to give Israel the land in Joshua chapter 1, but Israel did not take the land that was to be given to them as a gift. Instead, they assimilated with the Canaanites living in the land, and too often resorted to idolatry. The third theme is also important, and that is in the concluding chapters, the last chapters of the book of Judges. And that is exemplified in this very last verse in the book. In those days, no king ruled in Israel. Each one did what was right in his own eyes. So it was a period of chaos and warfare, loss of tribal territory, and social unrest. Looking towards a time when a king like David would come and bring blessing and peace. What is the outline of the book of Judges? I think it's fairly easily outlined, and that is chapter 1:1 through chapter 3, verse 6, is an introduction, the problems that Israel had in taking the land, and the cycle of sin that I mentioned a moment ago. Chapters 3:7 through 16:31 is all the stories about the judges. Then chapters 17 through 21 is the concluding appendices to the book, and that is the migration of Dan to a new territory in the north, and civil war with the tribe of Benjamin. First, let's say something about the initial chapters, chapter 1:1 through 3:6. Only Judah and Benjamin are even somewhat faithful in taking the land. Judah initially went with Simeon, and they took the land to the south, we're told. Benjamin was somewhat less faithful, and the rest of the tribes did not drive the Canaanites out at all. This gives rise to the cycle of sin in the book of Judges. What is the cycle of sin? The cycle of sin begins with the Israelites worshiping various Canaanite idols. Then the Lord would send an oppressor, a foreign enemy, to oppress them, defeat them in war, take their produce, put them under forced labor and other forms of oppression. Under their oppression, they cry out to the Lord, and the Lord hears them cry out and sends a deliverer. That deliverer is a charismatic war hero or judge who delivers them from the oppression. What follows then is a period of peace, and then they fall back into idolatry, and the cycle repeats. This happens 7 times in the book of Judges. And so most of the book is really about this repetition of this cycle of sin and idolatry, crying out, and deliverance. Let's look at the second major section of the book, and that is the stories about the various judges. There are 7 what we call major judges, and that is judges who are charismatic war heroes. Those are Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. There are an additional 5, that is Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, who are what we refer to as minor judges. Those minor judges, we don't have war stories pertaining to them. They didn't apparently deliver Israel from enemies, but they probably were judges who adjudicated court cases. There's one other, and that is Abimelech, who is actually the first king in Israel, and there's a story in chapter 9 about his aborted reign and his ignominious death. And so 12 judges in all, 7 major, 5 minor, and then a chapter devoted to one of Gideon's sons, Abimelech, who was a very bad king for a brief period of time. So let's talk about the various stories. The first one is about Othniel, who is also related to some heroes of the Pentateuch, and the earliest judge. That is, he is the only Judean judge, and he is known for fighting a battle with someone called Cushan Rishathaim, that is, Cushan of the double evil, from Aram Naharaim, and that simply means the Arameans on the other side of the rivers, probably between the Tigris and Euphrates to the north in what we would call today northeastern Syria. So he fought against the Arameans and defeated them to the north of Israel. That's all we know about Othniel. People cried out, the Lord sent a deliverer, and that was Othniel. The second judge is Ehud, who is known to Sunday school kids all over the world as the left-handed judge. Well, why is he left-handed? Why is that an important detail for us to know about? The Moabites were oppressing the people of Benjamin to the north of Judah, Moab to the east of the Jordan River across from Benjamin. And Ehud goes to King Eglon of Moab with a message from God, he says. Eglon takes him into his private quarters. Ehud, who's left-handed, extends his scroll that he has in his right hand, but as a left-handed man, he reaches under his right thigh and pulls out a short sword, and while Eglon is taking the scroll, he stabs him in his tremendously fat stomach, and he dies. Ehud escapes, goes back, rallies the troops of Benjamin, and they inflict a defeat on the Moabites. And so God saves them from the hand of the oppressing Moabites through Ehud, the left-handed judge. The next judge is named Shamgar, son of Anat. We do not know anything about him other than one verse that's devoted to him, and also chapter 5 in the narrative about Deborah, he's mentioned also briefly there. Apparently an early judge. We don't even know if he was Israelite. He has what sounds like a Philistine name, but the Lord used him to deliver Israel from the Philistines. He may have also even been an idolater, because his name suggests he is a devotee, possibly of the Canaanite goddess Anat. We're just simply not sure about who he was, where he came from, but we do know that he was a military war hero who saved Israel from the Philistines. Chapters 4 and 5, chapter 4 is the narrative account of the female judge, Deborah, who also is the only one we otherwise know, besides possibly the minor judges, who adjudicated court cases and had a sort of a traveling, itinerant judgehood where she would travel around adjudicating court cases. And she is a judge from the tribe of Ephraim. So again, we're moving north from Judah to Benjamin and now Ephraim. The Lord hears the Israelites who cry out against the Canaanites led by King Jabin of Hatzor in the far north of Canaan. And Deborah selects a general, Barak, to go fight the battle, but Barak says, I will not go against the Canaanites of Hatzor unless you, Deborah, a judge chosen by God, goes with me. Deborah agrees, but only on the condition, only saying that if I go with you, a woman will get the glory of the battle, and the glory of the battle will not go to you. Of course, they go into battle. Barak inflicts a defeat on Jabin of Hatzor and his coalition. His general Sisera flees the battle and finds refuge in a tent of a Kenite woman who is related to the Israelites but somewhat distinct. Goes into the tent. The woman of the tent was named Jael. She gave him warm milk to drink, and he was fleeing from the battle. He fell asleep, and then she put a tent peg through his head, and thus the glory of the battle went to a woman and not to the general Barak. Chapters 6 through 8, a more extensive narrative about Gideon. And Gideon was from Manasseh, so again we continue to go north relative to Judah. Gideon is chosen by God as the least member of a small family in Manasseh to fight against the Midianites. And the Midianites had inflicted all kinds of problems on the people of Manasseh. They were camel nomads from the desert, and they would sweep in and steal all the produce and afflict the Manassites in a variety of ways. Gideon, called by God, said that the angel of the Lord says to him, go in this strength of yours and defeat the Midianites. Gideon consistently requires some sort of reassurances from the Lord. The people are afraid. Gideon is afraid. And time and again, God gives him reassurances. One of these is the famous story of the fleece that Gideon throws out and wants it either wet and the ground dry, or dry and the ground wet around it being left out overnight, so that he would have proof that the Lord was with him, and the Lord provided him that evidence. The people go with him down to battle, and of course there are several thousands. All those who are afraid are sent home. There are still too many, thousands, and finally the Lord says, have them go down to the water to drink, and those who cup their hand and bring the water up to their lips, keep them, and the rest who put their head down in the water, send home. And so he ends up with only 300 warriors to go against this massive horde of Midianites. At night, they surround the Midianite camp with these 300, each with a torch inside of a pot so that it couldn't be seen outside, and with a trumpet, so that all 300 with a torch and trumpets blowing, suggesting a much larger group. They sweep down into the Midianite camp. The Midianites are so surprised and frightened that they kill each other, and a great defeat is afflicted on the Midianites by Gideon and his band of 300. The next story is about Abimelech, who's really the first king anywhere in Israel. He becomes the king of the city of Shechem. After the defeat of Midian, the people of Ophrah, which was Gideon's town in Manasseh, said that, we want you to be king. You and your sons will rule over us. And Gideon said, I will not be king, and my son will not be king. The Lord will be king over you. But upon Gideon's death, the city of Shechem asked Abimelech, one of Gideon's sons, if he would be king over Shechem. He agrees and murders all of his many brothers, except one escaped, Jotham. Jotham confronts his brother on a hilltop. It tells a famous fable about all the plants of the field came and requested that a cedar tree and a vine be king, and none of the plants that the wonderful plants that they came to agreed to be king. Finally, the worthless bramble bush agreed to be king. And the suggestion is that's exactly what Abimelech is, a worthless thorn bush that ought not to be king. Finally, while Abimelech is fighting a battle, a woman in an upper story of a tower dropped a millstone on his head, a heavy stone millstone, and that ended Abimelech's kingship over the city of Shechem. Chapter 9 tells the story, also the end of chapter 9, of a couple of minor judges. Actually, there's simply verses that mention the judges Tola and Jair. And again, they seem to have been circuit riding judges who tried court cases. Chapter 10, verses 6 through chapter 12, verse 7, is the story of Jephthah from Gilead, that is, the tribe of Gad and eastern Manasseh. The Gilead is the Trans-Jordan region on the east of the Jordan River. And so we move across from Manasseh to the other side of the Jordan, and this is the first such judge from the Trans-Jordan region. He was the son of a prostitute and a mercenary. He was kicked out of the family by his brothers, and so he got mercenaries around him and was a hired gun, we would say. Went around and fought people's battles for them. In the meantime, the Ammonites were oppressing the people of Transjordan, the people of Gilead. And so, because the oppression was so severe, his own brothers, people of his tribe, came to him and said, we want you to fight against the Ammonites. And he said, look, you kicked me out of my house, and now you want me to fight your battles for you. I will do it only under the condition that you make me chief over you. And so, not exactly king, the word king is not used, but some sort of ruler over them. And so, he is offered the headship of Gilead if he would fight against the Ammonites, and he agrees to do that. When he goes into battle against the Ammonites, he makes a vow to the Lord that the first thing that comes out of his house when he returns triumphantly, he will sacrifice to the Lord. That is really a bad idea, although he's probably thinking that most houses then house the animals in the lower floor. There was a region for keeping the animals safe indoors on a downstairs floor. Most houses probably had 2 floors. And so, thinking that an animal would come out, but instead, when he came back successful from the battle against the Ammonites, his own daughter came out to see him. There have been 2 different views of what happened to Jephthah's daughter and Jephthah's vow. Both of these views are quite ancient. The first is that he in fact sacrificed his daughter she requested that she be allowed to go into the hills and lament her virginity because she's single, um, with her girlfriends for a couple of months, and then let her father do to him as he had vowed. And so actually sacrifice her as a human sacrifice. The other view is ancient and still finds adherents, and that is that because she's lamenting her virginity and not her life, that she is actually um, going to be sacrificed, put that in quotes, as a Vestal virgin, that is a religious acolyte, a virgin in a worship sanctuary somewhere in Israel, where she would perpetually live in that sanctuary, sacrificial place, and be a servant to the priests, but not be literally sacrificed. In other words, a sort of sacrifice of her to become a nun of some sort. Because of what it says about her lamenting her virginity. Those are the two most common views of this kind of scandalous text. But I don't think the judges are held up for us as people that we would want to emulate. In fact, the point of the book of Judges is that people are idolaters, they are not good people. Samson is the worst of people, and yet God raises them up to take care of Israel's oppression and defeat the enemy in difficult times. Not because otherwise they were tremendously faithful in all their ways, because they were not. So don't think Jephthah's held up as someone to emulate, and these are sad times. And I think what my opinion is that he offered her as a sacrifice. The text doesn't say that that is a good thing worthy of imitating. Chapter 12, 8 through 15, the mention of three more minor judges, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. Then chapters 13 through 16, the longest narrative about the judges, and that is the story of Samson of the tribe of Dan. We've been more or less going north, from south to north, from Judah to Benjamin to Ephraim to Manasseh, across the Jordan to Gilead, and now we find Dan. And Dan originally was in the south by Philistine territory, close to Judah. But I think that at the time these texts were written, Dan migrated to the furthest north. The farthest north territory was the tribe of Dan in later years, because they are chased out of their territory by the Philistines. So I think that this is schematic. It is from south to north, and it's unclear whether these are sequential or whether maybe some of these judges may have judged simultaneously with each other, because these are regional fights. So the story of Samson. Samson was dedicated to God from birth as a Nazirite. That is, he was not to cut his hair and to abstain from any kind of alcoholic beverage. But Samson has some flaws, and I think there are two at least. One is his weakness for women, especially Philistine women, which there were 3 or 4 of these that he sought after. And the other was his desire for revenge. It seems much of the story develops is his desire to avenge himself on the Philistines, which does end up getting him killed eventually. After killing hundreds of Philistines and seeking revenge for acts done against him, against his betrothed wife, who they kill, he was finally captured by the Philistines, but then and had his head was shaven by his girlfriend Delilah, who was in cahoots with the Philistine lords, and therefore the secret of his great strength was in his hair. But his hair began to grow back, and his eyes were put out. Eventually, he was put in the temple of the Philistine god, and there the Philistines made sport of him, but he prayed to the Lord to return his strength so that he could kill the Philistines there in that temple, and the text says he killed more Philistines in his death than he had in his life. Finally, the last two stories in the book, chapters 17 through 21, the migration of the tribe of Dan from southern Dan to the far north, and then the civil war with Benjamin. We'll take these in order. Chapters 17 and 18 deal with chapter 17, Micah the priest. A family in the center of Israel is wanting to have their own Levitical priest, and so they convince a fellow named Micah to be their family priest. He agrees. In the meantime, the tribe of Dan has been run out, and so they're migrating to the north, looking for a new land to live in. They come across the homestead of Micah, the family that had hired the priest, and they convince the priest to go with them and be the priest for a whole tribe. And so he goes with them to the north. I think this is the origin story for why the city of Dan later on becomes a very, very important city in Israelite history as a sanctuary site for northern Israel, where we're told some form of idolatry happens. I think that their priesthood that is not recognized by Judah begins with this story. Secondly, they lost their land because of the idolatry of the people of Dan, and they go to the north to a quiet town named Laish. What you're looking at in this picture is the Canaanite city gate of Laish that was found some 20 or 30 years ago in northern Israel. This is for sure the Canaanite city of Laish. And they're able to take the city and finally settle there. And it demonstrates what happens in the book of Judges. Chapter 1, Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and they were successful at taking the land. By the end of the book, tribes are losing territory and falling into civil war. Chapters 19 through 21 deal with civil war with Benjamin. And we have a story about Gibeah in Benjamin, which is Saul's city, a little later on. A Levite goes looking for his concubine, finds her as bringing her home. She has fled him. He's bringing her home. They stop overnight in the town of Gibeah, and the people there behave like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and 19. They demand that the man who he's staying with, they demand that he bring out his guests so that they may know him sexually. And he refuses. Instead, they put out his concubine. They ravage her until she dies and then leave her body outside on the doorstep. Now, the story is not intended to say, aren't these great people worth imitating, but rather what a horrible state the nation of Israel is in at this time. The Levite comes out, sees that she's dead, cuts her in 12 pieces, and sends each piece of her body to a different tribe and says, when has this ever happened in Israel? Rise up and let's smite the Benjaminites. So all of the tribes come together and demand that the tribe of Benjamin give up the people of Gibeah who had done this. The Benjaminites refuse, and so the rest of Israel almost annihilates the tribe of Benjamin in civil war. There's a great story about, before they succeed in completely annihilating Benjamin, they say, wait a minute, we can't just destroy them because they're a tribe. And we've also vowed that they cannot take any of we will not give any of our women to them in marriage. But we're free of our vow if they kidnap wives. And so we'll let it slip that the women of the tribes will be out dancing in the field one night, and unsupervised. And so if they kidnap a wife, then we're free of our vow. So they do that, and the men of Benjamin who are left get wives that way. And it demonstrates, these two stories, the sad state of Israel at the end of the book. There is no king in Israel. Each one did what was right in his own eyes. Let's talk briefly about the theology of the book of Judges. First, I've mentioned this already, the number of judges. There are 12 judges, the 7 major and the 5 minor judges. And they are distributed south to north. The second theological theme that I want to focus on now, I've already done this at the beginning of this talk, is the judge's cycle of sin, which is found especially in chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. First, the people sin by idolatry. Chapter 2, verse 11, chapter 3, 7, chapter 4, 1. In fact, all of these judges. The people cry out in their oppression, and God sends a deliverer who is a judge, who delivered them through military might. Chapter 2:19 and many other places. Then the people eventually fall back again into idolatry, 2:19, and also again many other places. And so the cycle of sin in the book of Judges is what exemplifies all the stories of the judges from chapter 3 to the end of the Samson story. What is the nature of the Israelite judge? The Israelite judge is a charismatic war hero, first of all. Only secondarily, possibly, sometimes one who tries court cases. So not at all a judge in the modern sense of the term. He's a tribal chieftain with limited powers outside of his own tribe or clan. A few of the judges, we're told, did try court cases, and that is like Deborah, and the minor judge Jair, we know, tried court cases. There are some others who almost certainly had no legal aspect at all, and that is Samson and probably Jephthah. No legal judge in the modern sense, but rather charismatic war heroes. What is Israel's relationship to the nations around them? Joshua 23, the covenant renewal at Shechem, says that there are nations still in the midst of Israel when Joshua died. Chapter 23, 4 and 14. Their presence in Israel continued to be a snare to the Israelites. Joshua 23, 13, Judges chapter 2. The fact that most of the tribes did not drive out the Canaanites was interpreted as faithlessness, covenant faithlessness. Being at peace with those living in their midst and not driving them out was tantamount to making a covenant with them and with their gods. And in the course of time, their peace with them, their living alongside them, brought about religious syncretism. One can see this in the story of Gideon. Religious syncretism is mixing of religions, a little worship of Yahweh, God, a little worship of Canaanite deities. And Gideon's father, in fact, had an altar and a sacred grove there at his house to Baal. The practicality of worshiping Baal. Baal was a god of the spring rains, a fertility god that dealt with the economy, with ensuring that the rains would come when they're supposed to, the fertility of flocks and herds and the land, so that prosperity could continue. And that's what Canaanite religion was all about. The worship of Yahweh, on the other hand, was a worship of an invisible God who demanded covenant faithfulness and ethics, virtue, and no promises that there would always be prosperity and a chicken in every pot. And so Baal religion, idolatry, has always been very tempting to people, because it seems to says that it deals with events of daily life in a practical way to ensure health, wealth, prosperity, livelihood. But they're punished for seeking out these practical idols. Finally, the attitude towards kingship in Judges. I've mentioned that Gideon was extremely negative about kingship. His son Abimelech agrees and takes the kingship of Shechem, but eventually he's killed because of his taking of kingship and his murder of his brothers. His brother Jotham says that only a worthless thorn bush would want to be king. I mentioned Jephthah is offered the regional rule of Gilead and accepts it. The appendices to the book, the last two stories about the migration of Dan and civil war with Benjamin, have a very positive attitude towards kingship. In those days, there was no king in the land. And so that's why there's strife and loss of land and civil war, because there's no king like David. And so we have two views of kingship in the book of Judges. One is very negative throughout most of the book, and the other is, on the other hand, it's the on the one hand, on the other hand. On the other hand, a king is of benefit to the produce of a settled land and its economy. And so the book recognizes the value of a king as well. We'll see this theme, positive and negative view of kingship, going over into the books of Samuel as well.